And one of the presentation you're going to hear now from Katie Mathias from WCS is about an idea for something called park bonds. Now, the author of this paper is not here with us because he's a new dad. And so he has asked Katie to do the presentation for him. But it's all part of this network that we have of exchanging ideas. And so Katie's going to present on park bonds right now.
Thank you. As Ray said, I'm Katie Mathias. I work in Conservation and Wildlife Conservation Society, and I'm very happy to present on behalf of Benjamin the ideas that are put forth in a paper that he published in April of this year. They're available on his website, and we'll make sure to make that information available for anyone who wants to read in more detail. So let's talk just briefly about the issue that Benjamin's seeking to address, and as Fabian laid out as well. For a second. I'll talk for just a second and hope the slides come back. So there's first the issue that Fabian had laid out. We have several studies in addition to the one most relevantly laid out a minute ago, that there is an availability of investor money that's interested in investing in this space, and that while they are often seeking to be compensated with return commensurate with the risk that they take on from an investment perspective, they can be engaged to invest in the conservation space. And we also have, at the same time, a funding gap in conservation, both for conservation projects, businesses, and activities. And I think we don't need to study so much as to look around the room at the number of people who came out to a panel on innovative financial mechanisms to know that that is a reality. So what Benjamin proposes is a new financial instrument that's dedicated dedicated to conservation and suitable for institutional investors. He sort of highlights the total bond market, and then park bonds are those that would fill that space sort of next to, but not completely overlapping with green bonds. So I'll highlight briefly some of the opportunities that have existed with green bonds and what has worked and what presents a challenge for conservation. So as Fabian alluded to, the green bonds are really a bond model that includes some requirements that conservation or that climate or other environmental goals be achieved. Often what's necessary in order to make them attractive is that the risk-return model is put into alignment by having a loan guarantor who comes in to ensure that the credit rating can be sufficiently high and the risk of default of country or project risk can be sufficiently low that the investors are attracted to the investment opportunity. Where we see a challenge in exploring that for conservation is that, as many of you know, conservation projects are not generally highly cash producing. So there isn't a sustainable source of funding to ensure that there's cash to pay back the bonds. And so what Benjamin had concluded is critical to thinking about bond issues in the environmental space or the conservation space is that there's a high credit rating, that there's a relatively low coupon rate, and one of the things that's been an issue in green bond models is that in developing countries where the interest rates may have to be significantly high in order to compensate for country risk in the absence of a guarantor, the borrowing rate is so high that it's impossible to fund some of those projects. So the necessity is for a high credit rating, for a low coupon rate, and for ensuring that the results of the bonds are going to produce conservation or environmental impact. So here's the model that he lays out. The first is that bonds are issued, and again, a bond is just a financing mechanism where the bond is issued, you provide funding, and you guarantee a coupon rate or rate of return based on various risk factors, a steady return over time, and then you as the lender expect to have your principal paid back to you at the end of the time period. So in this case, the bonds would be issued, they'd have a low coupon rate and a high credit rating because they'd be guaranteed by a third party, most likely either a development or a World Bank kind of organization, or a country that's interested in providing that kind of loan guarantee, potentially in exchange for being considered for ODA. That also provides the investor with a guarantee against default risk. And the principal, the proceeds from that bond issue then go to what he's calling International Trust Fund for Protected Areas. It would be a new entity. It could either live at a host institution or it could be a standalone new creation. What then happens with that proceeds is that principal from that bond issue goes again into this International Trust Fund for Protected Areas and is invested in a number of vehicles, both traditional and potentially novel, to provide some upstream environmental positive impacts. The principal again gets invested, probably still to be determined, but let's say 85% of the principal might be invested in relatively traditional investment vehicles. A portion of it could go to green bonds, where we know that there would be an environmental benefit or a climate benefit from those proceeds. There may be some exploration of impact investing as well, but the goal would be to generate a return in excess of the guaranteed coupon rate that needs to be returned to the investors. So the bondholders would then receive the first, hypothetically, let's say 2% return, whatever the coupon of the bond was issued, but we'd expect it to be relatively low. And the investment vehicle, the investments that are being used to generate those returns would be producing returns in excess of that guaranteed 2% return. And then what happens to the rest of it? Well, the important point, the hook, if you will, in this situation is that the remaining, and again, we're going to assume a 5% return from the investment pool. The first 2%, the coupon goes back to the investors, and the remaining, in this example, 3% goes to conservation trust funds to be used for conservation activities. These do not necessarily, and in fact, they do not at all have to be cash-generating activities. They can be the same conservation projects that conservation trust funds are currently funding through their grant-making activities. The conservation trust funds would then in turn allocate the funds to the projects that they're doing. So the model ensures both the, again, upstream environmental impact through the types of investments that are made to generate the return, and downstream environmental impacts in the form of distributions by conservation trust funds to the conservation projects that they're funding. So a few quick conclusions. The idea of the park bonds is that they will allow a scale of investment and a broad size of investment that institutional investors are interested in committing to, that there are both upstream and downstream environmental positive impacts, that there are existing networks of conservation trust funds who already have mechanisms in place to allocate the proceeds of this venture to deserving conservation projects. But through this mechanism, the conservation trust funds have a resource mobilization or a fundraising mechanism that they can use in partnership. That there is a separation between the investors and the conservation trust fund recipients. So there is, Benjamin's describing it as land grabbing. There's really the investors would not ultimately have say or influence over how the funds were distributed. So there's less conflict of interest in that sense. And there is the opportunity to specialize park bonds as if they get underway and gain traction, to specialize regionally, to specialize terrestrially versus marine, to look into what kinds of bonds might be most appealing in the market. And I'll lastly sum up a few of the critical success factors that Benjamin's highlighted, that the involvement of a third party who can offer a guarantee to minimize default risk and change the return model for the investor ends up being vital. That the role of the conservation trust funds and the acknowledgement of the role that the CTFs play in achieving conservation goals is critical as well. That the park bonds might offer, the use of the guarantee might offer the insuring or guaranteeing country the opportunity to qualify for this ODA. The conservation trust funds, because of their independent relationship from the governments in which they operate, means that the bondholders are actually not needing to be concerned about sovereignty or country risk. I think I would skip ahead just to the last point, that critical to the entire system is the ability to determine that the results of conservation projects are actually being achieved and realized. And that's, of course, a question we have in all cases in flows to and from conservation projects, is how do we measure and evaluate the success of the project. So the need for transparency in the results of the Conservation Trust Fund work becomes vital as a communication mechanism back to the investors. I will leave it with that.
Thank you.